Very good. So, welcome everybody as our attendees for this symposium are joining us. My name is Alan Blackwell. I am the Director of Cambridge Global Challenges, and I'm also a professor in the Department of Computer Science here in Cambridge. I'm joined by my colleague from ICCCAD in Bangladesh, Professor Saleemul, who I will introduce shortly. But before we do so, I will just say a few words about the format of today's symposium. Eric, can we move to the next slide? So we have 2 hours in all, chaired by myself and by Professor Hook. We're going to start the event with 3 keynote speeches from Cambridge, from ICCCAD and Dhaka, and from Makerere University. And we will then move on to a series of short talks from young researchers. We have 6 short talks, which we'll be completing in the second half of the symposium. Just a few notes on the housekeeping for this Zoom meeting. Firstly, as always, please do keep your own microphone muted unless we invite you to ask a question. It's very nice to have a feeling of community in the room. So for those who are able to keep their camera switched on, please do feel free to do that. And for those who can see participants in gallery mode, please do make use of that so that we can feel that, that the 160 odd of us who are going to be attending have some view of the others who are present. We do hope that we will have some opportunity for questions and answers after each of the speakers, and we'll try to manage that as efficiently as we can, given the large number of speakers. If you do want to ask a question, our preference, if possible, is for you to put your question into the chat. And then the chair of that session will call on you if we have time. And if it turns out that there is not time to answer all the questions that have been asked, then please do feel free to continue to use the chat window for discussion with the speaker. And speakers, we hope, will also be able to respond in the chat window if we don't have time. If we do have time to call on you to make your question, to raise a question verbally, that would be a pleasure. But if we do so, we have only a couple of minutes for questions after each presentation. So if there is a verbal question, we'll need to keep those very brief. And then finally, I should note to everybody that this session is being recorded and that the symposium for today will be made available on the YouTube channel from Cambridge Zero. So at this point, I will, having finished the housekeeping, I will hand over to my colleague from ICCCAD. Professor Saleemul is the most eminent client scientist in Bangladesh. Is famous around the world for his contributions to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and many other forums, not least the least developed countries Consortium on Climate Change. Professor Hook is the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh. Welcome, thank you very much for co-chairing the meeting with me, Professor Hook, and I'll turn over to you to open the meeting.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you to Cambridge Zero for offering to co-organize this very interesting symposium together with my center, the International Center for Climate Change and Development. It's a pleasure to be joining forces with you, and I look forward to an extremely interesting event. I'd also like to thank all the keynote presenters and the young researchers who have offered to make presentations today. I look forward to listening to their presentations, and also thank all the participants who have joined us for this event, for joining us. So let me say a little bit about my center and the work that we do. We are called the International Center for Climate Change and Development. We are based at the Independent University Bangladesh in Dhaka, Bangladesh. But in addition to being a Bangladesh-based international center, we also run a network of universities in the least developed countries, which is called the Least Developed Countries Universities Consortium on Climate Change, LUCCC, or LUCC, we call it for short. And we're very pleased to have my colleague, Professor Mizan Khan, who coordinates LUCC, will be giving one of the keynote addresses, and David Mfitumukiza from Makerere University, who's also a co-founder of the LUCC, also giving a keynote presentation in a little while. So I look forward to listening to the keynotes and the presentations from the young researchers, and hopefully also having some time for a more general discussion amongst ourselves, as well as with the audience who will be listening in over the course of the next a while that we will be together. So with that, shall I hand back to you, Alan?
Thank you very much, Saleem. It's a pleasure to move directly on to the first of our keynote speakers. Dr. Ronita Bardhan is an urban engineer and urban studies specialist. She works on climate change adaptation in urban areas, and specifically in the use of data-driven techniques for convening, gaining evidence, policy, and responding to the problems of climate change adaptation in the urban sphere. Ronita, please feel free to share slides, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Alan. I'll quickly start with sharing my slides. And let me know if this is...
That's good, thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Cambridge Zero and ICCCAD, for arranging this sort of a very important, probably strategically positioned symposium at this point in time when we are just right after COP. So I'm very pleased to share a very short description of my work that I've been doing primarily in the Global South, and I will try to explain what future affordable housing would look like to moving towards the +2C world that we are currently trying to restrict ourselves to. So briefly, before explaining today's talk, I would explain what I've been working on. So I lead the Sustainable Design Group at University of Cambridge, and if anybody is interested, you can scan the QR code on your screen. And I work in these 4 verticals of sustainable development goals of health and well-being, clean energy, sustainable communities. And a part of my work does also respond to gender mainstreaming and gender equality in terms of as a developmental issue. So when Alan mentioned that I use data-driven design, what do I mean by data? And so I use a lot of data from sensors or various sort of technologies from built environments. So you might see a lot of pictures of me installing sensors in built environments around Cambridge. And that's one part of the data which is highly quantitative and it helps us to inform what's happening in real time also at some point. But then there's another set of data that I always use, which is very qualitative, and it kind of probably tries to understand the intangibles that create a certain built environment, and I call it these peoples and practices. I combine these 2 data to inform definitely climate challenges, well-being, and efficiency in terms of both energy and space, and overall reducing the health burdens or well-being burdens in a particular built environment, especially in low-income settings. So you will find my data come from very innovative sources like films or TikTok videos or Instagram reels, or it can also come from stories and narratives that people speak when you are not really interviewing them and they're not really being researched as a very formal setting. So given that setting, we all know that we are going to face much more severe and extreme and more frequent events in terms of as we move forward in the next decade. So we will face a lot more higher intensive heat wave days or high temperature days. And that's something I think it's better we acknowledge it and move ahead while we are planning, rather than trying to be seeing these as just some certain events, extreme events in a particular year. And this is going to be quite an important setting in the next coming decades, because if you see, we have already facing twice many number of hot days, overheating days across the world. And obviously there's no the kind of confusion that this will affect the most marginalized population and the more vulnerable population more severely, and especially those who are living informally across the global south and will form the future population. So today's talk, I'll try to deal with two different aspects. One is the urbanization tensions. So obviously urbanization tensions means you have to provide housing and close the housing deficit of the people. And that means then, and also an access to cleaner energy, and which will have implications on health and well-being. So that's a very direct link. But somehow if we can connect this link and generate a feedback loop towards the housing again, probably we can create these invisible infrastructures which not only help us create a better quality of life especially in resource-constrained settings, but also help us mitigate through these invisible infrastructure. I'm going to talk a little bit about what invisible infrastructure I mean in a resource-constrained setting. So this is a no-brainer slide, I think, but it's worth putting it just to help us remind that we are going to double our built environment stock in the next coming decades. And it's evidently important. You can see by the circles. Yesterday, I was attending a talk and somebody pointed out where your major circles, which are seen in the global south, would basically be accommodating more than 50% of humanity. And that is a very big number in consideration when you see how the future of Earth will look like in the +2C setting. So I'll talk a case study on India, where there are four big major policies that are coming up, and they are trying to address it by the end of the decade. Most of these policies should have reached their ultimate policy outcomes. And these policies are LPG for all, that is clean cook stoves for all and cooking fuels for all. Housing for all, which is around 20 million houses for 2020. Developing of smart cities, and tuberculosis-free India by 2025. So you can see the deadlines are fairly near, and they all, from the assessment charts, you will see they're almost reaching their goals in terms of separately. If you look at these policies, so India has almost reached its goal for housing for all, almost 90% of the total goal for clean cooking fuel for all population has been achieved. So it is almost there. Seems as if you look at them in silos, they almost look like as if they are achieving their goals, and we are going to have a very much more advanced future if you just look at the Indian subcontinent. And just to see how these policies interplay in a completely heterogeneous setting, in a complex setting as such as Mumbai. And by heterogeneous, I mean, if you see the picture on your right-hand side, you will see there are three different typologies of urban forms that you see here, and they do not coexist separately. They coexist with each other, and they are probably a continuous conundrum of urban spaces. So while there is a lot of study in understanding their heat signatures of all of these separately, what happens when you start looking at heat signatures when they are interacting with each other? So in a contrasting world like this is an aerial view picture of Mumbai, and you can see how what the starking contrast that Mumbai's urban fabric kind of places us. So what we wanted to see very importantly is there a thermal signature when these for these different typologies of urban forms, and is there a form which we should avoid in order to avoid reaching the 2-degree target sooner than later? So what we did was we took a prototypes, archetypes of urban forms across Mumbai, and they represent also different economic classes. And it's no brainer that you will understand the type 4 and type 5, which is the orange and the red, are probably the low income housing setting that needs to be understood both in terms of their contribution to climate change and how they are suffering in the context of climate change. So we went around installing a lot more sensors, but what we found out that while there is this whole notion that going high rise and high dense setting can lead capping to the carrying capacity of a city, but we found out that certain high rise open space, although they reach higher temperatures during the day, quite high, as high as sometimes 65 degrees, they stay for a shorter duration, whereas the low income compact or low rise compact setting, which is generally for low income housing, they retain the heat for longer and also take longer time to cool off. So given this setting, we wanted to find out, is there a particular, if you combine a lot more of these heat stress indexes of temperature, cooling potential, humidity, do we see an urban form which is highly heat stressed? And we did find that there is a particular urban form which is not really slums, but something different than slums, but it has a very low cooling potential. That means it retains the heat for longer, and it's probably the future hotspots of the city. And why this sort of form? So this was the first interaction with this sort of urban environment, and we thought that probably this doesn't exist a lot throughout the urban space, so maybe not a matter of concern. So, but then we realized that moving forward, there's this policy of housing for all, and that means there will be de-slumming of cities, and the cities would be basically removing a lot of slums. And what they are doing in this place, typically in India, they are removing the slums and creating these vertical towers in place of the slums. And that's interesting. And how do they look like? They are now across the city. So more than 50% of Mumbai's population actually lives in slum or slum-like settlements. So you're going to, moving forward in the next 5 decades, or even the target of 2022, you're probably going to see the whole city having these sort of high heat stress indexed urban forms. And that's a major concern, because this started it's not a very old policy. It started nearly in 1995. The houses were built around 2015, 2010. These were built. By 2015, most of these houses, slum populations were relocated, and the rest of the land. So how the policy works is, the rest of the land which is free, the developer gets it for free and makes luxurious apartment. So you see this housing here, which is the smaller one. It kind of, this one here is a transit apartment where the slum people are put in before they are building the slum rehabilitation housing. And that's a matter of concern, because they are going to get free housing in the state of Mumbai, in the capital city of Mumbai, which itself is a big dream for many people. And also they will not be relocated from their original space. So now the whole problem of slum rehabilitation housing is solved, but just by this one silver bullet policy. And it's extremely participatory bottom-up approach policy. And all is very good and fantastic. So we started looking at, if they are providing housing, is the housing good enough than the slums? So this is what it looks like. This is a very recent picture. One of my friends sent it from Mumbai in October. And so you see the transit apartment is now dismantled, and everybody has almost moved into the slum rehabilitation housing. So looking closely, this is a very simple house. So each unit is around 25 square meter space, and may have a toilet inside or may have a shared toilet at the end of the corridor. So not quite a good policy in terms of providing a unit space, not very high footprint though. And in reality, it looks like this. It's a highly dense urban space, which probably houses a massive amount of population. So housing problem is solved, tenureship is solved for a long time, which has been quite a big issue and a debate in the de-slumming of cities. But when we started looking at from inside and outside how these houses look like, so I don't know if you would call this a better housing or a this vertical slum, or because this is how it looks like from Google Earth image. And if you stand between the buildings, you will have this sort of a view, and you just look up and this is the amount of sky that you can see. So absolutely no brainer that these houses do not have access to better sunlight, and air quality is probably quite poor. So we wanted to understand if it is better than the slums, at least, because if they are being moved from a particular place, they should be provided better housing. And we found out only those population who never suffered any kind of health hazard or had lesser incidence of health hazard are people who have segregated kitchen or have more cross ventilation as more windows. So this is how it looks like when you just look at them from side, and we wanted to understand how air velocity plays a part in this role. So this, if wind is flowing from here, what happens to the units here? And this is a wind tunnel test we conducted. And we found out that obviously the windward side will have quite a good access to air velocity, but probably the leeward side will almost, the velocities would be zero. And this is what we see in our computational simulation model as well as validated wind tunnel test. So we started understanding what is the magnitude of the problem. Is it manageable, or is it fine, or is it, what is really the magnitude? So we started a measurement campaign. We did, as I said, we collected both the types of data, which I showed in the very beginning. And moving ahead, we started understanding the indoor heat burdens. And we found out there is one type of design which kind of have more heat burdens, that is the M3 version than the M2 version. So the M2 version was having more number of compliant days in terms of not creating more discomfort, whereas M3 was creating more of this higher discomfort ranges, and M1 is basically representation of the slums. So then we started looking more closer, and we found out thermal burden is rather gendered, because it's also a cultural aspect of what sort of dressing and clothing is required. And these values you see in CLO are basically values of what sort of insulation a particular clothing attire kind of gives. So more closer to 1 means you're almost wearing a heavy jacket, which we wear in winter in the UK. And you can see almost all. It is very clear that there is a lot of agency in controlling thermal comfort if you are from a different gender than female. And also the females reported that they were comfortable at a higher degree of temperature than the males. And this is not just because they're physiologically better off and they can tolerate more heat. It's also about the agency to cool down. So the agency to adaptive saturation is more of a cultural factor, which none of the engineering models actually look at. And so we started looking at these engineering. So we use this model, this sort of data into the engineering models of building simulation models, and tried to understand what would be the energy consumption looking like. And it definitely showed there was a quite high burden of energy. And then this brings me to the second question: what are the health impacts? And we found out that
Ronita, yeah. I think we have just a couple of minutes left.
I will wrap up very soon. And we found out that people, after moving in from the slums to these houses, they have increased frequency of visits to the doctor. And this is not because they have high access to medical facilities. That has not changed. It's just that they are kind of facing a lot more health burdens. So we wanted to see, is there a relationship between these houses and tuberculosis? And we took these three different designs of X design, I design, and H design, and started a measurement campaign. And this is what you see. We kind of rented one of these apartments for a week for over 3 months, spread across the year, and started emulating their lives, like when they cook, what they do, what sort of incense sticks they are burning. And this is what you see me cooking here, some chicken nuggets, just to understand their lifestyle. So we found out that the X type, which is also had provided better daylight and ventilation, but also registered less number of tuberculosis cases. And also, if you see the number of cases, it was basically after they probably they had the case before they moved in. So it was within a year that their cases were being reported. Whereas in the I-type and H-type, the cases were reported after they have lived in these houses for 4 to 5 years. And you can see these are the access corridors and these are the units. The units do not receive any sort of daylight. And there is absolutely very little ventilation or air velocity inside for creating access when appropriate ventilation. That gives me to the question in comparison to the slums, and we found out generally World Health Organization says that your indoor air quality should be around 40. But on an average, these both H-type and I-type were having an annual average of 350. And if they're using the most cleaner fuel, and if they're using a fuel stacking, then it's probably 3,000, around 2,500-700. And slums were performing much better in terms of, comparatively better in terms of the slum rehabilitation housing. So we wanted to see the technology and the passive and the technology, if we can solve this problem through technology. And we did find that by providing the extract fans, we could reduce it by 98%. But then in reality, if you look at how the extract fans are installed, most of the windows are actually covered because of storage space, and because to create the pressure difference for the extract fans to work, these the windows is almost compromised. So definitely passive and technology solutions work in pen and paper, but in reality they do not. So we need to include these sort of data into our engineering simulation models. We then looked at indoor air change rates and ventilation rates, and we kind of developed, if nothing can be done, can we just install a partition wall and change and advocate the change of location of their bed so that they are not in the direct plume of which you see in the dark red in the plume of the concentration of particulate matter. This brings me to this whole question of gender and health, and we found out that this is a film by BBC where they say this is part of our work that BBC covered, and here they say they are happy in moving to these houses because for the first time they do not have to restrict their food intake at night in order to avoid going to the toilets, but their health burdens have increased massively and probably it leaves women the most pressed in terms of time and also poverty. This brings me to our final work. Can we do something using technology? So we are doing this new work with UK Space Agency, where we are looking at these buildings from the space and trying to understand their heat signatures and trying to provide a solution to them. And if there is an alternative, and so if I have to just conclude the whole presentation, I would say use data as a means, not end into designing these houses, embed narratives of communities for future scenarios, identify the outliers, can help in contextualization, which is very, very important. Use design parameters as agents of change and evaluate policy impacts for multidimension. And if nothing else works, then make it a point to communicate to the stakeholders. And if that also fails, probably not all bottom-up approaches are silver bullet, and otherwise just pray. And so I will end my talk and thank you. Today I'm working across the global south, so all the black points that you see are the places where my projects are. Thank you so much, and I look forward to a very fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much, Ronita. So much in your very rich presentation, and I'm so sorry for the very short time that we gave you for wonderful presentation. Many questions have come in the chat. In fact, we're over time already at the start of our day, so we will move on. But Ronita, I do hope you can take our applause and perhaps attend to some extremely interesting questions that have come up in the chat. At this point, I will pass over to Professor Hook, who will be introducing our next speaker.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you very much, Ronita, for extremely interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. It's my great pleasure now to invite and introduce my colleague, Professor Mizan Khan, who is the Deputy Director of my center, ICCCAD in Bangladesh, but he's also the coordinator of the LDC University's Consortium on Climate Change, which I mentioned earlier, LUCCC, and he also happens to be a very long time negotiator in the UN Framework Convention in process on climate finance on behalf of Bangladesh and also the Least Developed Countries Group. And both he and I recently spent several weeks in Glasgow at COP26 in the negotiations there. So over to you, Mizan. You have 10 minutes, I understand, and Alan will be the timekeeper in case you go over your time. Mizan, please,
sure.
over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, let me try to share the screen. No.
You were getting your screen, but I don't think it's the right one.
Yeah. Fahad, can you help me?
Yes, I can share the screen for you, but I need the permission to share.
Can Fahad be given permission?
Professor Khan, you'll have to stop sharing so that Fahad can share, please.
Okay.
You just click stop share.
Okay. No. Stop sharing, I did.
Yep. Okay. Fahad? Yep.
Yeah, that's fine.
Excellent. Good. Go ahead.
So thank you, co-chairs. I have taken the title as I was given. So the title is Adaptation, its Background, Current Challenges, and Role of Universities in Co-Creating Knowledge. So next slide, Fahad. So this is the outline. I want to kind of look at the etymology of adaptation, how it evolved over time in the climate regime, then what are the current challenges, then role of universities, and what LUCCC is about. Okay, next, please. So you all know that adaptation was an afterthought in the Framework Convention, and mitigation was the prime focus, and that was right at that time. But then gradually, there was a movement for adaptation. Since mitigation was given focus, there was no definition of adaptation in the convention. Only 5 times the word has been included in the convention. And IPCC defines adaptation, as you know, I'm not going to read out. So there are various types of adaptation, as you know, which are anticipatory and reactive. But when we talk about adaptation in climate change, we automatically kind of define it as anticipatory action. Then private and public adaptations, and also autonomous and planned adaptation, all those things. So then gradually adaptation came to occupy a central place, and there are some reasons why it came to the fore. For example, since the third assessment report, adaptation started coming to the fore because they have third assessment report defined adaptation as kind of very much climate change as kind of very much a development problem, not just a climate change or environmental one. So there was the need for integration of climate change concerns into the development strategy. Then came Bali Action Plan, which put adaptation on the same kill with mitigation. And then Paris Agreement finally, included adaptation under Article 7 as a dedicated article. And that article recognized adaptation, kind of defined adaptation for a global goal to be achieved, as well as kind of a global responsibility. So the meaning of adaptation has been expanded from kind of national framing to kind of a global framing. Next, Fahad. And now, what are the challenges of adaptation? So you can see that earlier the narrow lens of looking at adaptation, which looked at adaptation only as if it brings local, national, or private good. So the core reason, this is, I argue, that the underfunding of adaptation, can be ascribed to this narrow understanding of adaptation. because mitigation is overwhelmingly funded, because each and every dollar invested in mitigation is viewed as bringing of global benefits, but adaptation is not viewed that way. So it remains underfunded. This is a great challenge. So we need to expand the conceptualization, legal and conceptual basis of adaptation. And then currently, for the last few years, for example, indirect impacts as borderless or transboundary climate change impacts are increasing, because as economies develop, so indirect or secondary impacts are increasing. So we also need to consider these while we take care of adaptation in terms of implementing its various dimensions. And then I have argued for adaptation now to have to define kind of as a global public good, you know, so that it brings in and kind of it puts more pressure on global funding. Okay, and then comes the locus of action. So far, the central governments, particularly in developing countries, have been designing and implementing adaptation actions. But experience has shown that centrally managed adaptation actions are not bringing the expected desired results, because impacts happen in specific places, locals. So also adaptation needs to be localized, regionalized, and those people and the GCA, you know, this Global Commission on Adaptation has brought LLA, locally led adaptation, as a new track, and for right reasons. And if we want to have something good in future for adaptation, then locally led adaptation must be the main mode where national governments only can facilitate. But this LLA must be locally led, which is still not the case. You know, currently about 4-5% of funding goes down to the local level, but you might be knowing that the LDC Vision 2050 has put kind of a goal of delivering climate finance up to 70% to the local community level. But it's a far-reach target. You know, I'm not very confident that it can soon be achieved. Once the developing countries, if they devolve, if they have a development based on devolution and decentralization, then only that can happen. Next, Fahad. And then let me come to the role of universities in co-creation of knowledge for effective adaptation. So capacity building is to reach different levels and scales. Okay, it involves people's, institutions, organizations as a whole, and their interactions. Ultimately, a society-wide development of capabilities. And it's a dynamic process, adaptive with evolving developments in reality, including the climate science, knowledge, and skills. And it is driven mostly from the inside as an endogenous process based on ownership, where external support can only facilitate, not implant, because capacity building cannot be implanted, and this has been shown by evidence of the last 3 or 4 decades. So actually, local community leaders who live in specific places for ages have great wisdom based on experiential learning in coping with disasters. And this knowledge needs to be brought up front, which has been neglected so far. And we need to bring this knowledge because they have grounded knowledge and experience. We may have technical skills, but technical skills and their age-old wisdom are 2 different things. So we need to differentiate these technical skills from wisdom. The former does not often add to the latter, that is wisdom. So COP26, para 6 of the 66 of the Glasgow Climate Pact recognizes the role of indigenous peoples and indigenous knowledge in implementing the second third-year work program on local communities and indigenous peoples platform for 22 to 24. And you know, these local communities and indigenous peoples platform now is a very active group. And the global community is taking cognizance of this fact. So, and this strengthens existing capacities to ensure sustainability if we include local wisdom, local knowledge. Next part. So here comes the role of universities in such co-creation. Tackling climate change requires building of long-term sustained systems at national and local levels. But historically, universities have proved to be the most sustainable institutions, even in the LDCs, low-income countries. Also, there are a number of universities in each of the countries, and they are the main arbiters of knowledge, where mass schooling have flourished based on this establishment of universities, and the university towns, mass schooling has started. And universities as a pool of multi and interdisciplinary expertise have a ripple effect across all segments of the society, from students to experts, thought leaders, and policymakers across all the strata of the society. And then in not so democratically or politically divisive societies, universities have better convening power as the highest seat of learning, with extensive outreach potential, both up and down, because the policymakers, elites also respond to university calls, and the university has got grounded relationship with the bottom layers of the society, because the students come from many different segments of the society, including the lower income groups, and most of the developing countries, I believe, have got some quota system to kind of allow the students from low-income countries who cannot afford the university education. So students come from I mentioned, all strata of society, and the faculty members, for example, give them research assignments, particularly during the master's program, and those students together, faculty members, go always on a regular basis, go to field, they stay with the communities and try to understand their conditions, and based on that, they do write research as their regular assignments. And this is kind of a co-creation of knowledge based on the technical skills that the graduate students have, together with the local level observations and understanding, and the interviews and discussions with the community people and leaders. And also university faculty and graduate students have had the potential, etc. I covered. And this slide shows, for example, that what are the frequency, for example, expressed in the NDCs by some South Asian countries. So here you can see, for example, research and development is the highest priority in terms of the need for capacity building, and that is where university and the local leaders, community people does have the potential to co-create knowledge. I think this is my last slide. Yeah, go to next, Farah. Yes, and here we have some publications on capacity building and role of universities, which you have access. These are published in peer-reviewed journals, including the book published by Routledge. So thank you, co-chairs.
Thank you very much, Mizan. Alan, do we have time for a quick question?
We do have time for a question.
Okay, good. So Mizan, there's a question in the chat box. Let me read it out for you. It says, what do you think are the most effective processes to ensure that local traditional knowledge is accurately represented and included in the UNFCCC process? And what was your experience of how this was implemented at COP26 in Glasgow? This is from Eric McKee. Would you like to answer?
Yeah, this is a very, very good question. In fact, this debate on indigenous knowledge and kind of considering the voices of the communities and their experiential learning is not very old. Just since I think from Cancun agreements, these voices were getting stronger, and now gradually the global worldwide movement is getting stronger, because they are not the indigenous people, because indigenous people you can consider as kind of minority in terms of shares of population, but local communities from the developing countries are uniting hands with them. So these voices getting stronger. The movement, I'm very optimistic that in future, because as we are focusing now more in the developing countries, at least focusing on locally led adaptation, and locally led adaptation means that adaptation has to be grounded involving the local community leaders, local civil society, and local community members themselves. That is why I'm very optimistic that in future, and that was the reflection at COP26, and in future in COP27 African COP, what we will see, I think things will get further into the right direction that we desire and we want. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mizan. I don't see any other questions or hands, so let us thank Mizan for an excellent presentation, and hopefully you can stay on for further discussions as we go along. So now it's my great pleasure to invite our next keynote speaker, David Mfitumukiza from Makerere University in Uganda. Again, a very old friend. David and I have been working together for a number of years. He's one of the founding members of the Least Developed Country University Consortium, which we organized together. And he runs the Africa side of this, because most of the LDCs are in Africa. So David, over to you. And you have 10 minutes for your presentation. You have to unmute.
Yeah, many thanks, Saleem. It's always very nice to be introduced by your role model. And I really thank you very much for that kind introduction. And so thank you very much to you all, and thank you for the invitation by both Oxford and ICCCAD to have this presentation and talk. Essentially, what I'll be talking about are general and in some cases specific reflections on my last year's 10 experience on working with the community and local level adaptation. My base is largely in the agricultural sector, but I do some cascading aspects. But essentially, just to be upfront, I'll be reflecting my experience for the last 10 years in the area of local and community level adaptation. And I will use that topic as the entry point, as was suggested by the organizers of the conference. I hope my screen can be able to see it moving, I hope, yeah. So, so the global goal on adaptation, as it was talked about by Professor Mizan in Article 7, which is about a goal on adaptation, on enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change, acknowledges and recognizes the importance of indigenous knowledge and also dealing with adaptation at local level. And this is what it's written on Article 7.5, indicates that the article acknowledges that adaptation should take into consideration vulnerable groups, communities, and ecosystems, and should be based on and guided by the best available science, and as appropriate, traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, and local knowledge systems. And I think this does not happen by accident or by chance, by mistake, but really because it's an important consideration which has not taken to the level it should be as we talk about dealing with adaptation. And of course, this is one of the ways to reflect on as we think about moving from the rhetoric that adaptation is local, but in essence, what happens is not necessarily local. Now, why should we even be talking about the local and community context? This is some points I've obtained in one of the blogs I have written, and then also one of the background papers wrote for the Global Commission on Adaptation, which I can share with you, on the importance of local and community context in adaptation. And the local context here, including ecosystems, the existing knowledge systems, existing capacities, and so on and so forth. They're very important. And from my experience and observation, the first thing is that if you do that, you will tailor risk management, and that enhances effectiveness. That's number one. Number two, you are likely to realize equitable results because you reach a level where you can go to disaggregate vulnerability. Vulnerability at that level, including vulnerabilities that are well understood and contextualized at that level. Also, it's a way of bring about holistic approaches so that in essence, you deal with all these issues, the whole society issues, including development priorities. People at community level do not disaggregate development and adaptation, they're always together. And when you deal with it in a way they perceive it, then you are able to realize more meaningful results. Local leadership is one of the things that emerges from really meaningful and honest consideration of local context. And that's linked to the fact that you are able to capture more granular and first-hand knowledge, which essentially is linked to what Mizan was talking about, including experiential knowledge. And that way, you get an opportunity to amplify that knowledge that is being exercised and experienced through various ways. Now, there are quite a number of issues that have been observed over time around the knowledge systems, the current knowledge systems. First of all, we see parallel strands of formal science and formal knowledge and indigenous peoples and local knowledge systems. That's one of the existing paradigms. The other thing is that we have domineering top-down approaches. Essentially, what gets money, what creates influence is what comes from the top, from somewhere, and usually imposed on communities. And this is within research, whereby we have seen mismatches between knowledge needs and research products. And that, of course, has implications on how those knowledge products are translated into action and also in practice and policy. And a little bit more about that, we see more of extractive research, whereby vulnerable groups, communities are looked at as research subjects rather than looking at climate risk and impact as the problem worked on in collaboration with those who are affected by the impacts of climate change. And because of all the above and many other things, we find quite a lot of inadequacies in documenting local and indigenous knowledge. That means we have limited availability of that knowledge and evidence to help make case for this knowledge. And yet, it would be a game changer in very many ways. To bring in the aspects of nature, again, communities and indigenous societies really are very much interwoven with nature. And more especially so in developing countries, in rural communities, livelihoods are dependent on nature, getting on wild foods, and even agriculture itself, which is a predominant livelihood base, is very much linked to depending on nature, wetland water supplies, and many other nature and ecosystem services. And even the development countries, their economies are very much linked to nature. So when we're talking about solving problems and especially dealing with climate risk, then nature-based solutions provides a very interesting key entry point to deal with climate hazards and building people's resilience to climate change. Because the health ecosystems not only deliver the much needed ecosystem services, but they're also very important in building resilience of communities to climate risks and impacts. Therefore, any impacts on these ecosystems is very much a big point of concern in as far as the economies and societal well-being is concerned. Another key factor, of course, because most of these communities and societies depend on nature, there's quite there are quite a lot of incidents of degradation because of some cases mismanagement that's leading to vulnerability of ecosystems and the communities themselves. Just some few examples from studies that have been involved in looking at indigenous knowledge from the traditional and local information systems, where you take into consideration social, economic, and environmental variables that are very unique to a particular location. And this is very important. It's very difficult to generalize indigenous knowledge, but it's very important to upscale the understanding of what can do and provide the available support to ensure that these indigenous knowledge systems help to create much more impact. And again, like I've said, the farming systems in Africa have for many generations, for example, depended on local and indigenous knowledge to respond to climate variability, especially in drought-prone areas, including planning for their movement. So there are quite a lot of well-established knowledge systems in that are about agroforestry, about mulching to make sure that there is moisture management within farms, construction of granaries as one of the ways of ensuring that harvest can be kept for a long time in the preparation for the shocks and stresses that may be associated with the failure to have expected crop production. Talking about crop rotation, they have systems that have developed over time. For example, what do you plant where in a particular season after another season? What would be the best combination of crops? But then also very interesting and very strong in the absence of well-established weather monitoring system is where indigenous knowledge systems are very much used in weather forecasting and planting calendar. Last month, I was in a field somewhere and people were saying, we have seen a lot of failures in weather forecasts from National Meteorology Authority. And we think if we compare our knowledge systems of forecasting are much better. But of course, not to say that they are performing very well, but they are saying they can depend on these in these indigenous weather forecasting systems as opposed to the inaccuracies they foresee. Now, just to emphasize the linkage between indigenous knowledge systems and nature, these are some of the examples that communities use as indicators in a kind of informing their knowledge systems. For example, use of flowering of wild plants as an indicator of how long a dry season is going to be, how long a rainy season is going to be. They look at changes in appearance of flying and crawling insects, which are not common in a given area that come at a particular point in time in a year. Looking at wind direction, the people have accumulated knowledge on how that can be used on the time left for them to have rains, changes in surface temperature, appearance of mist in a time when the weather conditions were different, flocking of birds, and very many phenological characteristics within the environment. Now, there is quite a lot of strong linkages between indigenous knowledge systems with nature because of the way their livelihoods and life systems have been interwoven over time. Now, how is this knowledge passed on within communities? Through personal experiences, and that's where Professor Mzin was talking about past experiential knowledge. People have gone through experiences and tested things, some of them consciously, others unconsciously, and over time, they have accumulated implicit or tacit knowledge through those personal experiences. It's also passed through community and local community law enforcement. They have established local and indigenous systems of enforcing laws. so that in essence they work together as communities to ensure that they sustain their livelihoods and the benefits they obtain from the ecosystems. Also, observance of traditional beliefs. There are quite a lot of taboos associated, for example, to environmental degradation of some specific tree species, animal species, such that in essence they want to emphasize the role and benefits and the knowledge they have accumulated over time, and want to underscore it. Cultural rituals, traditional storytelling, and then traditional songs. These are some of the things that have come from the studies we have been involved in, and those are some of the probably the entry points if someone wanted to document and also upscale these indigenous knowledge practices for better use and application. Just as a point of emphasis, these are I will start with the lower part of the slide. These two are granary stores. Now, they're from different parts of Uganda. They're all granary stores, but because of different experiences and environmental conditions at that level, at micro level, they don't use the same materials, and they have all the information as to why they don't use it. First of all, they will talk about what some of the species that you use have some other uses in the environment, so you don't want to put them to another use. Another thing is about the types of crops. The types of crops are different, and they would say if you use this kind of crop in a water-built granary, that will be a problem. So, and even other aspects such as these intercropping, mulching, these communities have different ways of defining what fits the context within which they are doing agriculture. And this goes into the kind of species they choose, the timing, and so on and so forth. And the point here is that then you're not going to have one size fits all for adaptation implementation, even when you're talking about indigenous and local knowledge. And this goes back to what I talked about. If you're going to bring an intervention, adaptation intervention that is disconnected from the existing experiences, there are going to be perceptions and attitudes, but also mismatch of experiences or of what they have gone through and how that matches with suggested interventions to adaptation. But another thing that that is very clear is that even the indigenous knowledge systems have been impacted upon by climate change. So the indigenous systems themselves are threatened, and these threats have implications. This is one of the responses I got in 2012 in one of the districts in Uganda, it's called Nakasongora. The old man told me, we used to know when to plant, what to plant, and expect a good harvest because we knew when rainfall will begin and end. Nowadays, rainfall comes and ends haphazardly, and we do not know when to plant and where we will and whether we will survive the year. This is an expression of frustration because they have indigenous knowledge systems, but they're being challenged because of the impact. The phenological patterns in their environments have changed, and so on and so forth. So this raises another dimension for research, and also to potentially link scientific or formal knowledge systems with the indigenous knowledge systems to leverage what is in these systems. Now, as I conclude, I want to end with suggestions on how we can do scaling of this in terms of creating impact derived from these knowledge systems. The first thing is really to continue promoting knowledge co-creation and collaborative learning with indigenous peoples and local communities. This will yield quite a lot of dividends and will make adaptation much more meaningful and more sustainable. And this should be, of course, accompanied with widely disseminated research that adds to the evidence base and reduces uncertainties on the effectiveness of indigenous and nature-based solutions for adaptation in particular contexts. As LUCCC, Least Developed Countries University Consortium, we actually have an initiative where we want to pilot this in 4 countries, in Uganda, Mozambique, Nepal, and Bangladesh to really try to come up with frameworks and mechanisms of how we can promote knowledge co-creation and collaborative learning with indigenous peoples and local communities as one of the ways of coming up with the more helpful knowledge systems. And then, of course, related to that is integrated knowledge systems to build synergies. I had already alluded to that. I think there's need to have synergies across implicit and formal knowledge systems so that the benefits from both ends can be made optimal use of. Then the other thing which I alluded to before is documentation of indigenous knowledge and creation of opportunities for these knowledge systems to share experiences so that way we can have more wide recognition of the role of nature and indigenous knowledge in adaptation, considering the role and importance that it does. Finally, then we also need to look at research on the impacts of climate change on local and knowledge systems and ecosystems at different scales. I alluded to that we already have indigenous knowledge systems already impacted by climate change. How much do we know about that? We need to investigate into this and see how we can be able to support, to provide evidence to kind of move beyond the challenges that are posed by climate change. And very relevant for universities, I think it would be very helpful to integrate concepts, evidence, and elements of best practice in all feasible curriculum and training in as far as indigenous knowledge systems and local knowledge systems are concerned. I'll stop there and I'll thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, for a very comprehensive, I thought, presentation. Alan, do we have a chance of a quick question?
I think just one question, yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
So, David, there is a question from Lata Sahunta. Let me read it out. She says, many thanks for a great talk. Local knowledge transfer is often through oral tradition in rural communities, rarely written in books or communicated online. What government or NGO dialogue, funding, or engagement mechanisms are most effective so that this indigenous data can be captured and harnessed to contribute to bottom-up and holistic solutions? David?
Thank you, Saleem. So very, very good question. And I think it's related to one of the points that I made. I think like partly the point that Mizan mentioned, universities have a role here. Most of the NGOs and other non-state actors, usually their projects, their work is projectized. So they do a lot of documentation and also do use of indigenous knowledge systems, but this ends with the time frame of the projects that are running. And in most cases, they are not working in partnership with the institutionalized arrangement for knowledge management systems. So my take is that I think universities need to take interest in this. The challenge has been that universities in most cases have always focused on speaking among themselves and find it very difficult, for example, to work with the communities and work with non-state actors. But I think I see university playing an important role in taking interest in undertaking documentation studies and also integrating these in the university efforts so that in the long run, we leverage the institutional arrangement that exists in universities so that this kind of knowledge is intentionally managed and documented over a period of time. But if it is still going to be on project basis, it will not work.
Great. Thank you very much, David. That's a very good point. The project timescales are often inimical to this kind of information collection and utilization. So thank you very much to all three keynote speakers. It's now time to move on to the next segment of our session with the presentations from our younger researchers, and I'll hand over to Alan to conduct that part of the exercise. And then I look forward to coming back at the very end with some comments. Alan, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to the three keynote speakers for wonderful talks. If only we had hours to discuss these issues with you, and please do continue discussion in the chat. For the second half of the symposium, we are now moving to a series of young researchers who will be talking about a number of specific scientific projects. The first of these is Maliha Masfiqua Malek, who is a researcher at ICCCAD, who will be talking about the seasonal variation of sea level in the Bay of Bengal. Maliha, please continue.
Okay, can you see my screen?
It's coming up. Yes, we see it, and not in presentation mode, but now we see.
Okay, it's okay. Okay, myself, Maliha Masfiqua Malek. Today I'm going to talk about the trend and seasonal variation of sea level in the Bay of Bengal, an analysis of high-resolution coastal altimetry. This work is part of a project called named Delta by the research lab LINS, which is a part of a French National Research Scientific Center. And let me explain the background. My region is Bay of Bengal, and the most difficulty to work with this region is the scarcity of long time series data. And we know that more than 170 million people live here in this region, like 40% of India, 25% of Bangladesh, and 7% of the Myanmar people live here along this low elevation coastal zone. So it is very striking point to know the sea level variation for this region. And for this study, I have considered satellite altimetry technique. This technique is quite evolving since the 1992. And with the beginning of this satellite altimetry technique, we know that the global mean sea level is right now 3 millimeter per year, but it varies region to region. So my purpose is to analyze the situation for Bay of Bengal, the sea level variation. There's two perspectives conduct here in satellite altimetry technique. The satellite emit micropulse to the sea surface, and the signal is then reflected back from the ocean surface, and the time delay of this time traveling is calculated as the distance of the measurement. And another perspective is the independent tracking of the satellite position relative to a fixed Earth coordination system. Combining these two perspectives, the topography of the sea surface is developed relative to the reference ellipsoid, and the technique is not that much simple to conclude the calculation the distance, because there are several factors we need to consider, such as geophysical correction, sea level, sea state bias, also instrumental bias, and ionosphere troposphere correction. They are very complicated. That's why these field is still developing, and I have used a regional 2019 altimetry mean sea level product from the Copernicus Marine Service to analyze what is the in general mean sea level trend for this region. And it is found that if the range is 2 to 5 millimeter per year, and as it's clear in this image that the variation is not uniform across every zone. So the advantage of Allen track product is that it's high resolution, and we can get good result near the coast, because the difficulty to get the data from satellite near the coast is challenging due to the land contamination. And for that reason, I have used a high resolution RS extract, which claim that it is able to mitigate the noise due to the land contamination. And to cross-validate, I have used the tide gauge in situ data, though there is not that much tide gauges available, which merge with my satellite altimetric period. So I try to consider 3 tide gauges to conclude the result. The methodology here, I consider the linear trend to understand the sea level rate, and to capture the sea level seasonal variation in periodic cycle. I developed this equation, combination of these two physical phenomena, from where we'll get the rate, the slope, and also the amplitude. You can see the amplitude SLS sea levels, SLS cycle here, and it seems that like the central part as along the continental shelves is having more amplitude, is like more 20 centimeter, and West Bengal is having 14 centimeter, and along the Myanmar, the amplitude is quite less. And if you see this graph, it's quite interesting that along with the decrease of the bathymetry, the amplitude is changing along the continental shelf. And here is a graph from the SLA trend, and it seems that the West Bengal is having 5 millimeter per year, and the situation is quite interesting for the Myanmar zone. This is a case study, like if I consider one alone track, such as this track, it's near the tide gauge Haldia, and which is 43 kilometers from the tide gauge, the track is situated, and this point is 12.7 kilometers away from the distance to coast. And it seems that for this track, as we go further from the coast, like after 10 kilometers, the percentage of the valid data increases, but before 10, it's quite less than 60%. So it's quite challenging to evaluate the result near the coast, especially first 10 kilometers. If we take this point and we compare with tide gauges nearby, it seems that only 57% variability is explained by my model, and the rate is 5.6 millimeter per year. And if you see the tide gauges is 6.4 millimeter per year, and the variability is quite good, 97% is explained. There's lots of difficulty because the position of the track and the tide gauges is not same. Also, the tide gauge is situated near the mouth of the Hooghly River, and the alone track is in the bay. So the scenario, geographical and location is not same. And if you see the correlation between among these three products, there's also another low resolution alternative product. It seems that this technique is quite interesting for further research in future, and its margin, the correlation is quite good for few points. So it seems that the seasonal and variation is quite strong along the continental shelf, especially central part of the Bangladesh, and the trend is in general 5 millimeters per year for the West Bengal and Bangladesh. But interestingly, for the Myanmar, the scenario is quite new. It's 8 plus minus 3.6 millimeters per year. But if you compare it with the tide gauges nearby, 7.5 plus minus 3.9 millimeters per year, it's kind of new for us. By using these techniques, we can understand the scenario of the sea level variation where the in situ data is not available that much. And it can be concluded that this product is 80% is sufficient valid point which we want for statistical analysis, and it is found along the 10 to 15 kilometer. So what is the application of this coastal altimetry in climate change adaptation? Like it will help us to design coastal infrastructure, info disaster management plan, and initiate coastal development projects in sustainable way, identify vulnerable coastal zones exposed to salinity due to sea level rise, and also assist policymakers in making decisions for climate change and adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maliha. Really fascinating and tremendously valuable data that you're collecting. And I can see how critical it is to pay particular attention to the variation in the coastal region, and very interesting your observations with regard to how satellite altimetry is perhaps not by itself yet sufficient. I'm wondering whether you have views on how that altimetry data can be enhanced with other forms of remote sensing. Is there any opportunity for this to improve the accuracy for coastal region?
Yes, it's a good news for us that last year there is a new satellite that launched, Sentinel-6 microphalanx. It is capable to eliminate few problems with the satellite altimetry tech, and it's a new era satellite for this field. And we are optimistic that very soon we will be able to measure the near coast scenario for each zone across the world using these techniques, because in these techniques is very efficient to reach each zone of the like for the world as well as Bangladesh. I really hope that we are welcoming into the new era of satellite altimetry.
Thank you. And a very interesting question from Eric, who says, do you also account for land subsidence rates?
Yes, like as I'm working with only satellite altimetry data, so I'm not considering the land subsidence, but as I mentioned, the tide gauge is facing the subsidence. That's why it's very tough to compare these two products, because it's in the tide gauge is in the coastal land and the track is in the ocean at the bay. So yes, the land subsidence is also an interesting factor for this region, which we also need to keep in mind.
Very good. And more interesting questions coming in by chat. Maliha, if you were able to perhaps consider answering some other questions in the chat. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
We will move on to Rekha Bhangaonkar, who will be speaking on irrigation management for building climate resilience, looking at in India. Rekha, please feel free to start with your slides.
Yeah, thank you very much. Are you able to see my slide?
Yes, we can. And do you want to go in presenter mode, into presentation?
Yeah. Is that all right? Is it on the presentation mode?
We don't yet see presentation.
Is it all right?
We saw your view, but if you can swap the two screens, then that would give us the other one.
Are you able to see the screen?
We see your presenter view, but we don't see the slide presentation. I think we would be happy for you to continue in this mode if that's the easiest for you to do.
Yeah, okay. Are you not, sorry for asking this question, but I would like to know, are you not able to see my screen at all? In the sense like,
yes, we see the presenter view. So it includes the main slide and also the next slide.
Rekha, can I give a suggestion? Sorry,
yes,
if you see in your top left, display settings, can you click that and can you see in the top left of your screen? It says display settings.
Yeah.
So if you click duplicate,
are you able to see now?
now if you share your slides again, and now click presenter mode.
Very good.
Looks good.
Ready to go.
Today. Yeah, thank you. Sorry for the glitch. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I'm Rekha Bhangaonkar. I'm a postdoctoral research associate at the Department of Land Economy, University of Cambridge. The project I'm working is titled Transforming India's Green Revolution by Research and Empowerment for Sustainable Food Supplies. This is a GCRF funded project and is also an interdisciplinary project. And my work in this project focuses on the use of groundwater for irrigation. So in the presentation today, I will summarize the research findings from the various segments of research that was the part of this project, as well as some from my PhD work. So I will start by a brief introduction to what this dryland region in India is and what its contribution. Sorry. Yeah, so I will start with a brief introduction to what is dryland region in India. So in this image here, what you see as the dark and the light pink color are the dryland regions in India. They typically they constitute nearly 2/3 of the cultivated land in the country. It contributes to nearly 40% of food production and provides employment to nearly 50% of the population. Now, the agricultural productivity in the dryland regions are heavily dependent on the annual seasonal rainfall, what we call as the monsoons. And due to increasing climate risks, particularly variability in rainfall, farmers are experiencing a dip in agricultural productivity. And in the year of very poor rainfall, they even report a complete crop loss. And therefore, government and various civil societies have been working on a model of rainwater harvesting. The idea is to use rainwater or harvest rainwater and utilize that resource to provide a source of irrigation. So a typical rainwater harvesting model would harvest the annual seasonal rainfall, use that resource to recharge the groundwater levels, and then farmers could access this groundwater for irrigation by investing in an open dug well. So our region of study is the state of Maharashtra. We chose this region because nearly 70% of the agricultural land in Maharashtra is classified as dry lands. This is also an interesting state because most of the dryland development projects, for example, the micro watershed development project and the more recent farm pond projects were first initiated and implemented in this state. They have also been successful in many cases. And within this state, we are interested in the district of Jalna. Jalna on an average receives about 700 to 720 mm rainfall annually. And this is only to indicate that in general, water harvesting projects are likely to function in this region. So in terms of the data that the research used, we have collected it firsthand, it's primary data. Farmer surveys were conducted in nearly 11 villages in this district. And we use econometric methods to analyze the results and analyze the causal relationship in irrigation management. So I move on to discussing about the irrigation management models that we were able to observe in our field studies. So the first one is the use of water budgeting tool. So with the image that you see here, the rows basically read the seasons or the months in a year. And the columns read the groundwater levels in various observation wells. So this water budgeting tool or this water budgeting notice is displayed in a public place in the village, and farmers or communities can use this information to have a negotiation or have a discussion and to understand a crop pattern or a crop choice that will best utilize the groundwater level available in that agricultural season. Now, what is interesting to note is the stability of dryland agriculture is built on the use of groundwater, and groundwater is a common pool resource. This means that it primarily exhibits two very important characteristics. One is that its availability is subtractive, and that the resource, it is difficult to exclude somebody from accessing this resource. Now, when I mean subtractive availability, it means that with the addition of a new resource user, the resource available for consumption to the group reduces, and the cost of excluding somebody from accessing the resource is very difficult, and particularly in the context of India, where the land use rights cannot be separated from the water use rights. Anybody who owns a piece of land also is entitled to the groundwater that flows below that land. It becomes challenging to have a management policy around groundwater. So the major findings of this segment of work is that the tool aids in dissemination of information, and this dissemination of information itself encourages the community to mobilize collective action for groundwater management. Another finding is that the tool is more successfully used when it is backed with the support of an agricultural extension agency. This is primarily to accommodate for changes in irrigation, changes in agricultural pattern. For example, when agriculture intensifies, it may be required that the design of the tool is tweaked to inform agricultural practices more well. And therefore, the tool is much more efficiently used when there is a continuous support by an agricultural extension agency. And a third point that we observe is that farmers with relatively more irrigation demand are the ones who are likely to be the conduit between the agricultural extension agency and the community, highlighting their agency as the managers of a common pool resource like groundwater. To summarize, knowledge-based tools are capable of encouraging collective action for management of a common pool resource like groundwater. The next irrigation management model we were able to observe was the social networking model. Now, most agricultural development agencies have used the leadership model for diffusion of new agricultural practice or new agricultural technology. By a leadership model, we refer to a group of few farmers identified by the extension agency. They handhold this group of farmers in a new cultivation practice or adoption of new technology, and successful adoption by this group of farmers then become a reason for others in the community to adopt the new practice as well. So here we use the social networking model to infer what is the level of network that is there in the community and how they have been connected to each other. And what we see here, these blue dots are the initial set of farmers that the agricultural extension agencies were able to train. And you can see how each and everybody in the community is either directly or indirectly connected to these main agents. However, the interesting thing is that even when we introduce a new technique or a new agricultural practice that is targeted to resource conservation, a widespread adoption, which is again possible by the social network model itself, becomes a reason for resource depletion. So our major research findings from this segment of work is that social learning does foster the idea of community ownership of groundwater. Groundwater was referred to as our water in the regions that we studied. And they also mentioned that if we do not take good care of our water, if we do not utilize our water well, we lose it our neighboring community. A second finding is that social learning encouraged private provisioning of irrigation. This is more in the context as agriculture intensified, when the competition for groundwater increased. So the social learning equipped the community to sort into more private provisioning of irrigation. A third finding is that collective action has upheld resource use rules. It is important to notice this point that in spite of agricultural intensification, farmers were able to, the community was able to uphold the initial resource use rules that were set for the use of the common pool resource. So to conclude, social learning shapes irrigation management practices. It not only encourages diffusion of new technologies, but also shapes irrigation management practices and the social cohesion that is possible because of a social networking model in the community upheld resource use rules. A third model that we have observed is that of private provisioning. Nearly 60% of farmers in India are smallholding farmers, which means that the land they cultivate is less than 2.5 hectares, and they need to derive their income from this small piece of land. But most agricultural development policies, particularly for the dryland regions, have encouraged farmers to adopt horticulture and thereby improve their possibilities, improve their opportunity to earn farm income. Farmers in the region also aspire to adopt horticulture because, one, it is a sign of agricultural progress. Secondly, adoption of horticulture itself elevated their social status in the community. Thirdly, and most importantly, it is economically more feasible for farmers to invest in irrigation and map it with the cultivation of a high value crop. So in the table that you see here, you see
Rekha, would it be possible? Rekha, could you please wind up in a couple of minutes?
This is the last slide.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is the last slide. Yeah. So in the table here, you can see even small holding farmers on an average have at least one well. And as the land holding size increase, you see that at least 2 to 3 open duct wells are owned by farmers. And more interesting is to see the investment in farm ponds. So farm ponds are groundwater storage. It is reduced to become a groundwater storage infrastructure. And even a small holding farmer is ready to invest in a capacity that allows him to store nearly 2 million liters of water. So a major research finding from this piece of work is that in shallow aquifer regions, farmers find it cost effective to invest in wells and farm ponds and choose horticulture as a means of agriculture diversification. Horticulture cultivation did not indicate a scale disadvantage. What we observed was a constant returns to scale. However, adoption of horticulture resulted in reduction or shrinking of farmers' crop portfolio. For example, a small holding farmer subjected nearly 40 to 80% of their lands to horticultural cultivation, while a similar allocation by somebody who has at least 10 acres of land was only 20 to 40%, saying that the rest of the land was subjected to dry land crop cultivation, the crop portfolio becoming much more resilient to climate change vulnerabilities. And the third observation is that bore wells are still not a phenomenon in this region. Instead, farmers are allocating a larger share of their land for construction of larger farm ponds. This is to indicate that while we think about land use changes, we are looking at changes in crops, but we also see that land has been used for investment in agricultural infrastructure. So to summarize, horticulture adoption is perceived as an effective strategy to mitigate climate risks and ensure farmer income. Private provisioning for irrigation plus horticulture model is cost effective in shallow aquifer regions of the country. Thank you very much.
Rekha, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. We will be moving straight on, but I see that there are some questions coming in the chat. If you could perhaps continue discussion there. We're going to move on to another presentation from ICCCAD. This is from Farah Anzum and Afsara Binte Mirza. Farah, you have your screen. Do you want to start presenting?
I hope you can see it.
We can see it. Please proceed.
Afsara, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Thank you so much, Ellen, for giving us the floor. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're joining us from today. I'm Afsara. I'm currently working as a junior research officer at ICCCAD. And today, me and my colleague Farah Anzum will present findings from a project that we did with World Wildlife Fund, titled as People Protecting Landscape and Seascape. Next slide, please. So as we all know that indigenous people and local communities, they really hold close relationship with natural ecosystem as their livelihoods and values are shaped significantly by nature. And they also play a crucial role in enhancing those ecosystems. Even though they're the ones who are the most marginalized in terms of healthcare, education, mainly in preserving their traditional ecological knowledge, but they do protect 80% of the world biodiversity. And you know, while doing this study, we also saw that they hold close cultural and spiritual ties with their land, and this also helps them in conservation and natural resources. But interestingly, in this study, we also found that, you know, indigenous people and local communities do play a key role in nature conservation, climate change adaptation, mitigation, and their nature-based practices are actually evolved by utilizing their indigenous and traditional knowledge. But unfortunately, many policies and laws at both national and international level still fail to recognize this. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. And you know, while doing this study, we did conduct a systematic secondary literature review where we had the chance of reviewing around 440 literature for over 6 to 7 months of period. And you know, the study areas of this paper were chosen based on the importance and existence of IPLCs residing in various countries that are really helping to defend their lands, but also at the same time playing a key role in nature conservation through their nature-based practices. And you can see in the map that these were the 15 countries that we had the chance to gather evidence from. And after that, we did do a data selection round where we selected a few keywords that would help us to really collect the literature. And we used the search engine, Google Scholar, Scopus, and ResearchGate. And now my colleague Farah Anzum will guide you through the rest of the presentation, where she will talk about the results that we found in terms of climate change adaptation, mitigation, and also disaster risk reduction, but also the way forward and discussion that we came up with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Afsara. So hello, everyone. This is Farah. I'm a master's student at Independent University, Bangladesh. So I'm going to onward from this section. So as Afsara said, and based on the literature, we try to see the role of IPLCs from the different perspective to triangulate the situation and to analyze the current context. So initially, we tried to see the IPLCs role in the disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and mitigation. As we already found that IPLCs are the most vulnerable because due to the various systematic exclusion from the political or economic power, or the removal from their homelands, or deprivation of material that will ultimately reduce their capacity to adapt to the climatic risk or the disasters. But in spite of that, IPLCs have been living with nature in harmony, and they have developed a variety of nature-based practices to protect the ecosystem as well as their livelihoods. We have found out many different cases and examples. For example, IPLCs in Guyana or IPLCs in Yemen have conducted or have applied many of the traditional knowledge to protect from heavy heat or temperature, or to adapt with the drought. Later on, we tried to do a sort of estimation to see the IPLC's contribution towards forest conservation, but this is a mere and a simple illustration that how much IPLCs are actually contributing towards climate change mitigation and adaptation. Rather, it is not an addition or extension of any methodology. And we also try to see the human-nature relationship. So as we can see, currently IPLCs regulates around 11% of the world forest, and there are at least 17% of the total carbon storage of the world is existing in this kind of forest land. So we considered a price of $2 per ton of carbon, and we estimated the total carbon storage in these 15 priority countries, which Afsara just mentioned. And we found out that there are 115,000 million metric ton of carbon is potentially stored in this forest land. And if we transfer them into values, then that is estimates about around $230 billion US. Moving to the next. To understand this human-nature relationship, we also tried to see the conceptual development over time. And we saw that before 1968, there was a notion that the human and the nature's relationship is more of a one-directional. That is, the environment has been treated as a more of a source from where the goods will be given to the human, and rather not in a reciprocal way. But over the years and over the time, there are many different concepts came up. For example, the ecosystem services, nature-based solutions, Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, then we have ecosystem-based adaptation, services to ecosystem, and so on, which talk about this very intricate relationship between the human and nature, which is very important to maintain over time to actually conserve this environment, as well as ensuring the social well-being. And this is also one of the most important part of the concept of nature-based solution, which we are talking today and which we are trying to highlight, that these IPLCs or these humans are, and this nature relationship is very, very significant and vital. Also in 2020, we have seen the IUCN nature-based solution standard worldwide, which talk about the 8 criteria and indicators, which also focuses on a lot of aspect of rights and governance of the people and the participation of different segments of the society to conserve the nature, also to promote the social well-being. So this is more of a timeline that we try to develop. Then moving to the next section. We also try to collect many different case stories around the world where we can show or illustrate the IPLC's nature-based practices and how they're adapting with the different climatic threats and or the climatic problems. And we collected around 15 case studies under the 3 major themes, like nature-based solutions for disaster preparedness and weather forecasting, NBS for agriculture, food security, and also to protecting the traditional NBS and the rights and governance. There you just can see the name of the different countries where from where we collected the case stories. If you are interested, we can definitely share the stories with you later. And then moving to the next part, then we try to see the policy context globally as well as nationally. So this is more of a timeline where it talked about the evolution of the integration of indigenous peoples' recognition in UN system. Over the time, we have seen that there are many different legal aspects or the policies which talk about indigenous people, but their recognition in the policy level has almost took 30 years to be considered in the global commitments and goals. Like, for example, if you look at this whole timeline, in back in 1923-25, it was the first time when the rights of indigenous people on their lands were talked about. And over the many different events and the years, in last 2014, it was the first World Conference on Indigenous People, which actually signifies and shows the best practices on the realization of the rights of indigenous people. As we are trying to see the IPLC's contribution in climate change, adaptation, and mitigation, we also focused on the national determined contribution or the NDCs of the selected 15 countries, and we analyzed them, and we saw that even though these 15 countries have made many different promises and pledges to promote the different actions to do the climate mitigation through GHG reduction or land use change, but none of them highlighted the IPLC's contribution in their NDCs without only Canada. And then we also dive into the national policies of these 15 countries. You can see the...
Farah, can I ask you to please draw to a close in a minute or two?
Yes. Okay, so there you can see the different policies which also talk about the IPLCs in those nations. And there are 5 countries at the right bottom which have no act right now. So moving to the discussion points. So from the study, we saw that IPLCs have the long-standing nature-based practices, but there's a challenge of scientific research on the efficacy of these practices. And we also see the 115 million metric ton of carbon storage, which also provides a scope to learn about the IPLC approaches. And we know that in the global political level and the policy level, we have few of their mentioning, but still there is a lot of gap. Then also as a way forward, we can say there is a need of collaboration among the stakeholders to strengthen their contribution and also to mobilization of their finance and partnership. We need scientific and policy research, training and education, and also the skills development, for example, writing or negotiation skills to actually represent their voice in the global level. So this is the research team who worked for around 6 to 7 months for this study. And at the last, I would like to thank Dr. Delphine Ganopin and Ms. Elaine from WWF International and Dr. Saleemul, the director of ICCCAD, for helping us and guiding us over this through study and all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to both of you. And this area of research is the main priority of our ongoing collaboration between Cambridge and ICCCAD. So I'm sure that we will continue to speak to you about this work for months to come. The advantage of having 2 speakers is that one of you has been able to reply to questions in the chat while the other was speaking. So please do continue if anyone else has questions for Farah and Afsara in the chat. At this point, we'll move on to Ramit Debnath from Cambridge, who will be talking about use of computational social science in climate and energy justice narratives. Ramit, do you want to present your slides?
Yeah, I started to share.
We see your screen share. Do you want to move to presenter mode?
Yeah. Yeah, is that fine?
Very good. Please go.
All right. Hi, everyone, and nice to meet you, Alan and Eric. So I'll be talking briefly about the work that we have been doing, and especially I'm doing with Caltech at the moment on using tools from computational social science to understand narratives of grounded stories, basically, from people. So first part is mostly from my PhD, where I looked into energy injustices in slums and how people can help us better understand the challenges that we face in transition and understanding where is the problem of distribution or distributive injustices in these areas. So the paper cutting that you see is the first step exploratory study that we did around 1,224 households in slums in Mumbai to understand what's the main problem that's happening. And one very common answer was rising electricity bills. And that has, later we found that has deep connections with how these places are designed and the urban planning aspects of it. So the framework is basically trying to understand where is this energy inefficiencies happening, whether it's a policy design problem or whether it's more of an urban design and housing design problem, or whether even it's a socio-cultural problem with the system. So that led to 2 zones of exploration. One was trying to understand from a very empirical point of view that what is the demand side basically in these housing conditions. So what are the appliances people own, and how much is appliances is changed when people are moved from horizontal slums to the social housing, which is called slum rehabilitation. So this slide shows, you can see that there are certain specific appliances that were quite highly purchased when they moved to the social housing structures. So for example, TV and refrigerator and even fans, these were already there, but also they were purchased on moving there. So that was one of the very definite energy intensive burden that was created. And also some of devices like air conditioning, which is anyway, they are very highly energy intensive. They were also purchased quite frequently. And this, I'm not showing the graphs in percentages on the right hand side, but if you just see it in absolute percentage, so it's almost a black bar shows 100% increase in air conditioning purchase when people move to that. So that creates a problem in terms of there. We then observe there are certain poverty traps in these areas, and to understand that poverty trap, we need to go into two ways. One was to spatially kind of diversify, because it's not just one Mumbai problem. There are similar slum rehabilitation housing in Brazil, in Nigeria. So that was one of the motivation that we tried to see distributive injustices in India, Brazil, and Nigeria, and then try to capture people's voices from ground through focus group discussions and also interacting with the community in the first place, and then use some of the tools that we have from natural language processing and computational social science to basically try to figure out where does the theme emerge. So during that point, I started to develop a method called deep narrative analysis, which is basically a mixture of two nested approach. So one, you have very machine learning driven topic modeling, which is quite often used in text analysis. And the second part was from grounded theory, which is widely used in qualitative research because it gives you an ability to come up with very localized theory of what's happening over there. And then we had the text narratives in large portion, because that, if you consider text as a raw data, so that gave us a lot of data points to play with and to understand what's happening. So this model, I called it deep narrative analysis, because we try to understand the narratives mostly rather than the other way around that's happening in text-based analytics. So just a bit of the method. So it's building on how we choose hyperparameters in topic modeling, and then try to understand where is the theoretical saturation happening in grounded theory. So the left side is the very standard flow of how you do grounded theoretic research. The right side is plot like for mathematical notation for topic modeling. And that's where the important point comes in, is that where the people who are using it, or the analyst, gets quite an extensive tool to understand the theoretical saturation in these places. So now going back to results, so that's how we did the focus group, mostly with the women who were there in that community, because it's also a very gendered problem in slum rehabilitation places, because they are the one who stays a lot and spends most of the time in that built environment, interacting with the energy devices. And the semantic map, basically the size of the bubble that shows which words or which terms were spoken the most, and that shows more critical interactions with the entire human scale energy services. So it goes from right from storing food in refrigerator and using refrigerators like as a higher utility devices. For example, people used to store flour so that they can sell it to the market next day. So that's an economic utility use of that as well, apart from storing food. Similarly, with how people interacted with the built environment, like they used to keep the windows closed for most of the time, and because there are privacy and safety concern in those built environment. But again, that closure led to thermal discomfort, because there is no other way for cross ventilation or any other points in those places. So this interplay of how design and energy use interact with each other. So we captured that very well through the deep narrative analysis. And this is the same, again, comparatives with Abuja, Brazil, I mean Rio and Mumbai cases, and it's similar that appliances play a very central role in when we understand distributive injustices, and that points us towards how can we design welfare-based policies, especially in social housing. Can we supply some of the appliances that are more often used by people? So and by doing some of these policy interventions, what we found that it have very significant effect not only on energy efficiency, but also on reducing electricity bills. And that again fit into the broader discussions around operational energy demand reduction and the climate debate around it. So more from the narratives is that you can see that these are the thematic clusterings that we find from topic modeling on the right-hand side, and which are supported by some of the actual narratives that people say on high electricity bills across the 3 places. So there are 2 ways to use this tool. So first, it gives you an ability to zoom out, because it gives you a macro picture of the 3 cases. And then you can also zoom in to each of the places and again play with and explore the narratives more statistically, that what's happening. So for example, the first theme on like the red bars that shows basically the problems with built environment, that housing design, there is no window, kids don't have place to play, and how it kind of infers in energy use and energy bills, because that led to people to stay more indoors and interact with TVs, So that again increasing the energy intensity of the household, which wasn't the case in terms of horizontal slums because they had community spaces, which wasn't there in these newly social housing. So that remains one of the problem. And the other was high electricity bills because no one came from the authorities or administration to check the meters. And they used to get lumped bill after 3 to 4 months or even 6 months. So that's one of the problem. And while zooming in, there are other similar instances of what's happening across the 3 places. And we show it using a probability distribution table that shows like which term was more interesting in these places and which themes were. So I won't go in much detail because of time constraint. And similarly with built environment factors, one thing that came a lot was lack of open spaces and public spaces. And that again fit into the high electricity demand because of how the household practices are changing because of that. So that calls back to a policy tool on urban planning of these low-income communities. Similarly, with fuel stacking behavior, that even though you have electricity in the other parts of the house, you still retain some parts of your earlier practices. And this is very specific to Nigeria, where we saw that even with electricity, they have firewood in the kitchen. And that has its own health burden, but people are not yet urban enough to change that practice. So it's a very transitioning dimension of how people interact with the energy services and the new built environments in social housing. So from a very applied point of view, what we did was, so I then started to work with the international energy agencies in November and try to propose this kind of tool in understanding broader net zero phenomena in a city. So how can we plan net zero futures in a city? And this came right before COP26, where they focused a lot on digitalization as a tool for policymakers and then figuring out different areas. So what I showed was a small example where you can use people's collective intelligence to plan for energy resources or even billing cycles, energy efficiency. And then you can extend it in broad cases where you have more data flows through digitalization tool. And the other example is on public perception of climate tech. And this is what we did with, also Ronita was involved in it, and David Reiner from Judge Business School, that how do we use Facebook to understand electric vehicle uptake. So we use Facebook.
Ramit, we're coming towards the end. So if you could close up in 1 or 2 minutes, that would be great.
Yeah, that's fine. So we use Facebook posts and interaction that people have in public domain to understand how they use electric vehicle and what's their perception of climate tech like electric vehicle. And we use social network analysis to find out the interaction and where is the centrality and betweenness in that. So I won't go into much detail, but because these are the events that triggered some of more interaction in Facebook across the PESTEL framework, which is political, economic, social, technology, legal, and environmental. So across these PESTEL domains. And then we found that there are many levels of changes that's happening when we talk about electric vehicles. So for example, environmental, people were more excited about social and health benefits of that and the justice aspect of it. Whereas from a technology point of view, it was the subscription model of EV. So can electric vehicle be placed as an Apple Music or Spotify? So that's where there is a huge demand on microelectronics to support that kind of EV model. And similarly, there was a lot of emphasis on the social justice and welfare elements and the smart city discourse. That again goes back to digitalization and net zero policies for the future. So that's me very clear on the work that we have been doing on using both narratives from social media and also from very people-centric interactions.
Thank you very much indeed, Ramit, and a huge amount of really fascinating research there. There is a question I see has come in the chat. So if you could attend to that in the chat, that would be great. Thank you again. We will move on at this point to Savio Rousseau Rozario from ICCCAD, who will be talking to us about land use and food security in Bangladesh from the perspective of climate change and development. Savio.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for giving me the floor, Eric. And yes, thank you.
And we have your slides.
Yes, thank you so much. So a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our viewers from home and abroad. I'm Savio Rousseau. I'm currently working as a junior research officer at the International Center for Climate Change and Development, in short ICCCAD. And today I would like to talk about our recent work, which is titled as Insights on Land Use, Agriculture and Food Security in Bangladesh, Way Forward with Climate Change and Development. And we anticipate that this paper will be published very soon. So Eric, can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is what our outline looks like for our talk today. So at the beginning, I would like to put a glance on our country and then about our research, and finally the findings from our research. And at the very end, we have some study findings and the way forwards. Can we move to the next slide, please? Okay. So to begin with, Bangladesh, as we all know, it's a country from South Asia. With a land area of around 56,000 square miles, with a huge population. We have a population of more than 166 million people. And the climatic condition that we belong to is a tropical monsoon climate. And our GDP for the year 2020 was around $224 billion with a growth of 2.37%. And of this GDP, service sector provides the highest amount of 57%, and agricultural sector provides around 13%. And just for a comparison about the population density, I have put in the UK's population here. As you can see from my slide, that in UK, 282 people live in per square kilometer area. However, in Bangladesh, it is twice as half of the size of UK, where more than 1,200 people living in per square kilometer. So can we move to the next slide, please, Eric? So undoubtedly, population growth is a huge problem for our country. Along with, we have some socioeconomic challenges, which refers to the basic needs, for example, food, water, sanitation facilities. And above all, we have a new challenge, it is climate change. And in our research, we actually focused on climate change and its impacts on the agricultural sector. So first, what we did, we thought of analyzing the past, present, and future scenario of the agricultural sector in our country. We identified some socioeconomic challenges as well as the impacts of climate change on agricultural sector. And we also reviewed some national policies, existing adaptation measures. We tried to identify the gaps, and we looked forward with some recommendations. In terms of the methodology, this research was very straightforward. We did a systematic literature review. We searched for keywords from our Google search engines. We looked out for papers, scientific peer-reviewed articles, NGOs, newsletters, fact sheets, and we did a short listing. And of our shortlisted articles, we found out 56 articles which were quite relevant to our study. So we included those findings in our study, and we also reviewed 12 national policies, considering the time frame from 2000 till 2021. And we also took the help of QGIS. We extracted data from Landsat 8 to develop the maps for land use, land coverage. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So from our findings, it is quite obvious that the agriculture sector is one of the major sectors of Bangladesh, and it is very important as it addresses the challenges of food security, livelihoods, and employment. And in Bangladesh, it is more than half of the population, I would say, like 65% people are directly or indirectly dependent on this sector. And it is also the primary source of income for 87% rural community. And as I mentioned before, that agricultural sector, it is contributing 13% to the national GDP. And some studies also identify that agricultural sector actually helped to eradicate poverty in the country from the year 2005 to 2010. And if you can see the graph on the screen, you'll be observing that right after the independence, the population as well as the production, requirement, and demand, it grew tremendously. However, the amount of arable land, it decreased and it remained the same. So these are some challenges that we found out from the available data. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we have identified 4 major challenges, which we termed as social challenges in in terms of the agricultural sector. So the first challenge that I mentioned prior was the population growth, and it is according to the Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics, they have projected that the population is going to be more than 245 million by end of 2050. And the second challenge that we are facing is a rapid urbanization. And because of rapid urbanization, every year we are losing thousands of land areas, agricultural land area. And a study reported that 80,000 hectares of land, agricultural land, is lost annually because of rapid urbanization. And there is also another problem, which we have termed as agricultural land fragmentation. And it happens more in the rural areas where the families are breaking down into nuclear families, and the agricultural land, it has been divided among the family members. And this is resulting to our fourth challenge, which is the conversion of agricultural land. So this land, the agricultural land, these have been converted into lands where there no agricultural productivity takes place. They totally belongs to the infrastructural development. Now, infrastructural development, to some extent, it is great. However, unplanned infrastructure development is surely a challenge. So from this graph, we can clearly understand that the amount of urban population is increasing day by day. However, the arable land is decreasing. And the map that we have developed, we can observe that from 2014 till 2020, the amount of urban area has expanded in Dhaka district. However, the amount of forest land or green vegetation has decreased. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So talking about major natural disasters of the country, this was one of our other area of our study finding. So Bangladesh is vulnerable mostly because of its geographic location. And if we consider the major natural disasters, we have cyclones, we have floods, we have droughts, and salinity, sea level rise and salinity intrusion. And as you know that in terms of cyclone, as Bangladesh exposes broad south to the Bay of Bengal, so cyclones are regular phenomena in our country. And in the year from 1960 to 2010, we had 52 severe cyclone storms visiting this area. And then we also have a flood, regular flood, as you know that Bangladesh is situated on the GBM Delta Basin, which means the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna Delta Basin. So this is also one of the major reasons why we face frequent flooding. Flash flood is a common scenario in the northeastern areas. We also have drought from the northwest, and finally the sea level rise and salinity intrusion in the coastal belt. So how climate change is actually influencing this major natural disasters? Well, natural disasters, these are regular phenomena in our country. However, because of climate change, the intensity is increasing. The intensity and the frequency of these natural disasters are increasing, and the recent IPCC Article 6, the fact sheet for South Asian region, clearly states that the heat wave, the extreme temperature, the extensive rainfall, marine heat wave will surely increase. So we can obviously feel how climate change is going to influence these natural disasters. And in terms of agriculture, as it is very sensitive to weather and climate, so a minimal fluctuation in the rise of temperature can bring a catastrophe to this agricultural sector. Can we move on to the next slide, please?
Savio, can I ask you please to draw to a close in a minute or so?
Sure. So these are some existing measures, adaptation measures that we found from our literature. So I won't go through everything. However, we have segregated the measures into 4 segments. We have the structural measures, the non-structural measures, the research and innovation. We have also segregated the vulnerable areas into 3 different regions: the drought-prone areas, the saline and storm-prone areas, which is definitely the South Belt, and the flood-prone areas. And I would like to focus on these 2 interesting measures: the floating agricultural measure, which has actually drawn international attention, which is a great adaptation technique, which was introduced by the locals, and also the surgeon method, which is widely practiced in South Asian region. And a big thanks to our Bangladesh Rice Research Institution and Bangladesh Agricultural Universities to develop stress-tolerant varieties of crops, introducing them to the farmers. So can we move to the next slide, please? So to wrap up our study findings, we have found 3 key factors that are influencing the agricultural sector. First comes the rapid urbanization, rapid population growth, economic growth in terms of infrastructure development, and also climate change. And because of this rapid urbanization, people are moving out from rural areas and they're heading towards the urban areas. So this is there has been a transformative change from an agro-based economy to a pre-industrialized economy. And this practice is actually threatening the food production and to meet the national demand. And at the same time, climate change is also impacting the food security. And there has been a lot of cases where people are changing their occupation, farmers are changing their occupation to other, so that which are more economically benefited. So the policies that we have identified, the policies state that there should be a mechanization in the agricultural sector. However, we need to mainstream climate change factor into this policies. However, Bangladesh, even though we are facing a lot of challenges, there are some significant milestones that Bangladesh has achieved. As you can see from our slide, we are the first on jute export, and we ranked 2nd on jackfruit production, and eventually 3rd, 4th, and 6th for freshwater fisheries, vegetable production, rice production, and potato production. Can we move to the next slide, please? This is going to be my last slide. So these were our recommendations the way forward. So first of all, we need to safeguard and we need to have the smallholder farmers. As smallholder farmers, they're the maximum in terms of the population. So we need to help them, and at the same time, we need to recognize and mainstream the local knowledge and adaptive knowledge that they possess. Where Professor Mizan and Dr. David they have mentioned in their talks that we need to recognize and mainstream these practices, their wisdom into action, and then we can also introduce climate information services for the farmers. So a couple of days ago, I was going through some articles where I found that there were some practices for farmer school in Africa. So we can do something similar here in our country. We can open a farmer support center. We can introduce farmer markets where farmers can directly sell their products to the consumers. We can also have extensive research to introduce climate smart crops to reduce the GHG emission from the agricultural sector. We can enhance the institutional and community capacity. And finally, we can update the basic facilities in the suburban and rural areas so that they don't have to move from the rural areas to the city centers. Rather, they get all the necessary support services in their surrounding suburban and rural areas. So that's all from my end. Thank you.
Savio, thank you so much. And as we are drawing to the end of our time, and we have one more speaker, please can I encourage you, if you have questions for Savio, to follow us up in the chat. Our final speaker is Chiron, who will be speaking to us about Mongolian traditional ecological knowledge and its relation to climate change. Please proceed, Chiron.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me. And hello, everyone. I'm Charon. I'm a PhD candidate at Wuhan University in China. And now I'm visiting the Department of Social Anthropology here in Cambridge. And today I'm going to present my research, which looks at indigenous Mongolian people's traditional ecological knowledge and their adaptation to climate change in China. And today, since I only have 10 minutes, I prefer to give you a broad view of what is happening in Mongolian inhabited area and is climate change affecting this area or these people. So what I try to do today is try to provide a kind of just a more general remarks about setting of the conference's theme of climate change, and also set it in context of the relation between one particular element in Mongolian life, that is mobile pastoralism, and its environment. So my research focused on indigenous Mongolian people, and Mongolian is one of the few ethnic groups that practice mobile pastoralism in China. And Mongolians lived for centuries as nomads, maintaining intimate relationships with the environment. So even today, many Mongolian people continue to live in this traditional way. And so they has not contributed much to the climate change, though yet it's facing its impact. Herders in Inner Mongolia, because they directly depend on the pasture and the river and the water resources for the livestock, and therefore I think they're among the most vulnerable groups to climate change impact. And during my field research, I noticed that Mongolian herders do not have a particular local term for the phenomenon of climate change as it understood today. Rather, it is through the description and explanation they give it to the current situation of their physical environment and particularly its impact on their livestock that makes one understand and infer the concept of climate change as we now understand it. So I'll say that this only because they cannot explain the phenomenon as a trained scientist can, but they are able to perceive the change and offer explanations and carry factors in their own way. So yeah, the data presented in my paper is involved my interactions with Mongolians, is particularly the indigenous Mongolian people in Inner Mongolia, the Byron Red Banner. So yeah, Inner Mongolia is located in northern part of China, and the Byron Red Banner is in eastern part of Inner Mongolia. So, and here is the 4 areas I did my field research. And justification, what I'm saying, the average annual temperature in Byron Red Banner has increased by more than 2 centigrades over the past 60 years, and the length of forestry period has been increasing since the 1960s. And the herders first observed the impact of climate change with the increase in severe weather events like storms, droughts, and extremely harsh winters. In Mongolian, we call it zot. The 2010, the zot was one of the worst ever, resulting in the deaths of approximately 8.5 million livestock. And so here I quote from one of the herders, and excessive heats in recent years has even affected our rivers. The rains do not come at the expected time, and when they come, they do not last as they used to. Today, rains cause floods easily because there is no vegetation layer to absorb them. The topsoil of our pasture land is very thin because of the land degradation. Flood doors everywhere. We are indeed in a deep crisis. And there's also a number between 2007 and to 2017. Byron Red Banner experienced more than 30 extreme floods on record, which caused nearly 4 billion yuan damage. So yeah, the Mongolian traditional ecological knowledge. I would say it uses a multiple environmental elements management through the integration of pasture land, water resources, and animals, of course, the livestock. So it's a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief about the relationship of living beings with one another, and of course, including the human beings and with their environment. So Mongolian herders have a tradition of moving livestock to pasture land that can supply adequate and superior nutrition for the land and animals. The Mongolian mobile pastoralism is an effective and proactive measure to protect the environment from degradation by making full use of the Mongolian pasture land, water, and wetland, avoiding excessive concentration of grazing. So I would say because of its flexibility, herders are more capable of manage the risk, like the extreme weather. And we have a really interesting word called otter. In Mongolian, it means like a short or long distance movement to cope with drought and snowstorm. So during the snowstorm or during the drought, smaller groups of households gained access to pasture of other groups through the development of like informal relationship. So I would say the mobile pastoralism is kind of a traditions of mobility, flexibility, and most importantly, the reciprocity. And what is interesting is the Chinese government released a set of laws and policies to adapt to climate change. And the most obvious difference from other provinces and cities plan is in Inner Mongolia take the grazing prohibition as a really important part of coping climate change. As you can see in the 14th five-year plan for climate change in the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, the grazing prohibition is like a really important part. And also the grass livestock balance is also the part of the grazing prohibition. And yeah, also you can see that the fight against illegal acts that destroy grassland. So it is really interesting that the mobile pastoralism has become an illegal act in this plan. And yeah, and this is really interesting that from the 2016 and 2017, only in 1 year, there's like more than 4,000 cases about violating the regulation of grazing prohibition. So changes in property rights regime from common to more privatized land tenure have also decreased the ability of herders to pull risks across households through joint action and joint ownership of assets and resources. And in Inner Mongolia, the implementation of the privatization and the settlement and the grazing prohibition has resulted in a physical and social fragmentation that has significantly decreased herders' ability to engage in otter and the mobile pastoralism. And yeah, and the Binte region actually it is the first region in nomadic area, like first to implement this kind of privatization and settlement. And during my interviews, the responses are not very positive, and I noticed the cost of animal husbandry has become unbearable high, and most importantly, they're not able to herd the animal freely again. And yeah, this will be my last slide. And during my interviews, I noticed a lot of things like this. I noticed a drinking problem has become really severe in this area. And many of them said they're gonna give up the herding and move to the city. So these are the climate casualties, or in this future will be a climate casualties that we are all talking about. So, and always you have this kind of responses like, I'm not well prepared, what can you do with the weather, it's beyond our control. So yeah, and actually my initial thought presented in my paper, in my article is we can rely on the local legislation to tackle this kind of problem. And because it is really interesting that the settlement and privatization, it's first start in southern part of China, and it introduced in Inner Mongolia in 1980s, late 1980s. So I would say this kind of system is originated and developed under the premise of targeting agriculture area. But yeah, I quite question its effectivity in Inner Mongolia, the nomadic area. So I have suggested that initiatives on indigenous people's environment, particularly in the advance of climate change, must be designed culturally with goals not only advancing indigenous people's social and economic well-being, but also increasing the ability to maintain their distinct cultural identities, languages, and connection with their traditional lands. So I think modernity does not necessarily equate with sedentarization or privatization. Traditional knowledge and practices also can retain a really great value. And local knowledge provides communities with the flexibility to adapt to change and cope with uncertainty, and thus is useful for local governments and planning, particularly as governments plan and prepare for the future climate changes. So due to the time limitation, I cannot go into much more details, but if you have any suggestion for me, I'll be very grateful. And if you're interested in this topic, please do send me an email and we can talk about it after the forum. Okay, thank you so much.
Jorun, thank you so much. That was really a tremendous end. And we have two questions that have come in for you already by chat. I'm interested in one of them, which from Shafiq Ahmed, he says, how has the change in teaching the Mongolian language in schools affected the indigenous community?
And this is a really big issue in Inner Mongolia last year. Yeah, actually, the government says they're gonna replace the Mongolian languages class with Chinese, but actually, as far as I know, it hasn't started really officially, because I think you all know there's like a really big protest in Bengal last year, but I think the government is starting to try to like introduce more of the Chinese content into the textbook, the Mongolian textbook, but it hasn't started like really officially yet.
Okay, interesting. Well, we hope for the best for the Mongolian community in the future, and thank you for the insights to their responses to climate change and the policy.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of our speakers. This has been tremendous, and we've packed in a huge amount of content in a very short event. So thank you for your patience, as I've had far less discussion than we would have liked. At this point, as we close the meeting, I would like to once again call on Professor Hook to make some closing observations. Sharon, I think, yeah, do we still have a screen shared?
No, I think that the screen share is gone, but I don't see it.
It's just my view for some reason has changed out of gallery mode. I don't know why.
Professor Hook isn't here anymore. I think he's lost the connection. So.
Aha!
Sorry.
Okay. Perhaps I'll work backwards in the chat to see if we have time to answer one or two more questions. Charuna, we have a question from Lata, which is, no, actually, I can't quite parse that question because I think there's a grammatical problem in it. At this stage, perhaps the best thing to, yeah. At this point, I think we will just close with, unless someone else is burning to make an observation relating to all of the presentations that we've heard. And I think I would just like to say at this stage that this has been the final meeting in the series of symposia that Cambridge Zero has been convening for the term. So perhaps, Eric, since this is also, in addition to being this larger international event, it is also the closing event in your own series. So Eric, is there something that you would like to say just to mark the end of the term?
Sure, yeah, I can say a few words. I think so with this, as Alan said, we've had a series of different symposia throughout this term, and this was so we've covered lots of different topics. And for anyone who hasn't been able to attend the other symposia in person or online, we've got recordings of all those symposia available on our website. So please do go and have a look there if you'd like to follow up on any of those discussions that we had. And we'll be running another series of symposia next term after Christmas. And I will actually be sending out a request for feedback to everyone who attended today, and also everyone who attended the previous symposia, to kind of find out how people have found the format and the different types of content we've had, and whether you'd like us to do anything differently in the future and so on. So please do look out for that email from me in the next few days, and I would be very appreciative of your feedback, so that we know how we can improve these kind of events in future. And this was the first time actually today that we ran this as a collaborative event together with Cambridge Global Challenges and ICCCAD and LUCCC. So I thought it was really great actually to have this real diversity of talks and presentations from people all across the world. And so I personally enjoyed that format really well, and I hope everyone else enjoyed it as well. And but I'd be really interested to hear your feedback, as I say, on how that new format and that collaborative format worked today. So yes, thank you all very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Eric. And thank you again to our guests and friends from ICCCAD, from LUCCC and elsewhere. Really wonderful to join these communities together. And we think a very positive start for the ongoing relationship, because there has been interaction between Cambridge Zero and ICCCAD for a couple of years now. ICCCAD is the key international partner for Cambridge Global Challenges as we work on problems of climate change adaptation together. So we do hope that there will be many further opportunities for these communities of people to continue their interaction with each other. So do look out, and if you'd like to become involved more closely, please feel free to contact me, Eric, or Sarah Swadezo-Holleran, who is also on the call, because we continue to have a number of really fascinating projects that we're working on with ICCCAD and with other people who've been speaking today. So to close the meeting, just once again, thank you very much for your contributions. To Cambridge participants coming to the end of the academic year, I wish you well for a break from your academic work. For colleagues in Bangladesh, I look forward to our next conversations. So thank you everybody, and farewell.